Welcome to episode 12. I've got a lot of stuff for us to cover today, so just a quick outline and we'll get right into it. Now, I did quite a bit of work off camera because I didn't feel the need to take up a lot of time with things like sanding and painting. We all know what that looks like. But here's a brief recap. As you can see, the hull has been painted, and I've finally decided on a color scheme for the boat. A rather somber one, yeah, but I think it works. I've also installed the rub rails. Now these pieces have to conform to the hull both with a fore and aft curve, and they also mimic the sweep of the shear. And to make these parts easier to deal with, I run them over the ferrule of a chisel, both fore and aft, and on the top side only to impart that upward sweep for the shear. It doesn't have to match exactly, but getting it to bend at all simplifies matters greatly. And another thing that simplifies matters greatly is painting them prior to installation. And there was nothing special about the installation, just glue and clothespins. And that catches us up to the present. Now the only subject for today is the tubs that hold the whale line and how to fill them. The amount of line carried by American whaleboats varied dependent on time frame. For our boat, about 1870, the loose standard was a total of 300 fathoms, 225 fathoms in the large tub and 75 in the small one. Now the tubs I measured at Nantucket Whaling Museum were, for the large tub, 25 inches across the top, 18 inches across the bottom, and 15 inches tall. The smaller tub was the same for the height and the bottom width, but the top diameter is 21 inches. Now, when I took those measurements way back in the 1990s, I didn't have much direct contact with artifacts from the period, or written sources citing specific examples. I had the Nantucket Whaling Museum, because that's where I was living at the time, and they did a monumental job of filling in the many gaps in my knowledge base. And I had Eric Ronberg's book on building a whaleboat model, and I had Ansel's book on building whaleboats at Mystic Seaport, neither of which gave much specific size for whalecraft, tubs included. My only hands-on reference was the Beetle boat at the Nantucket Museum. So I measured everything in that boat, tubs included, and took it as gospel. Now, it wasn't until I started this video series on building a whaleboat model that I began to question much of the information I had gathered and relied on for so many years. And a case in point is the large line tub. It should be able to hold about 225 fathoms of line, or something close to that. And the upper diameter of the tub was constricted by the distance between the numbers 4 and 5 thwarts. In the case of this model, that's 31 inches. And if you look at the diameter of the tub in this clip, it's easy to see that tub is considerably more than 2 feet across. And when you see it situated in the boat, as you will in just a moment, there should be no doubt remaining as to its size. It is not the 25 inches displayed in the Nantucket boat at the time I took the measurements. So how could this be? I have a hypothesis. Line tubs look suspiciously like wooden laundry tubs, the type used far into the 20th century, except that the latter were commonly about 2 feet across the top, It wouldn't surprise me to learn that way back when the display at the Whaling Museum was first being built, they found the need for a large tub. Possibly not having the actual line tub for the boat, they had to find a reasonable replacement. And it didn't need to be an actual line tub. Anything close would do, just so people got the idea. So, a trip out to great-grandma's house in Sconset to retrieve her antique laundry tub, and before you could say, don't look too closely here, the humble vessel that kept great-granddad's union suit looking so spiffy was repurposed and enshrined as part of our glorious maritime past, helping to educate millions. Sort of. Now, keep in mind, this is just me offering a possible, if somewhat far-fetched explanation for this academic anomaly, but it reinforces the point I made a couple of episodes back about not taking all you see in a museum as hard fact without considering context. Question all you see, if for no other reason than for your own satisfaction. Now, the upshot as it relates to our model is that I increased the size of the line tub, the large line tub, substantially, from 25 inches to 30 inches at the top, and from 18 inches to 21 inches across the bottom. Now, the small tub looked about right for the job, given the cramped space it had to occupy, so no changes there. Line tubs, right? Yeah. Now, I've always used a lathe to turn the tubs, and for all the cooperage on the models. Making the tubs this way gave acceptable but not great results. Like the tabernacle hinge in an earlier video, I wanted a better way. And in the first episode of this project, I said I would try and gear this build towards those of you who either don't have or don't want to have a huge inventory of tools and machines just to build a boat model. So here, for the line tubs anyway, is an almost machine-free way to make some tubs. It's not new. In Eric Ronberg's book, To Build a Whaleboat, he describes his method for doing this without a lathe. Now that I've tried it, I don't think I'll go back to my old ways. Now, Ronberg's boat was built at 1 to 16th scale, twice the size of the boat we're building. But the method scales down beautifully with no problem. So here it is. The tubs are built around an armature, consisting of a top, a bottom, and 2 cross pieces. And the armature has a hole 30 thousandths in diameter running through its center. That's a little alteration I made on my own. This will allow me to place it on a sewing needle held in a pin vise, and this will be a great help when dry fitting and assembling, as you'll see. To determine the height of the armature, I had to think about how much room I wanted to have for the Whaleline coils, and after a little deliberation, 3/32 or 94 thousandths seemed reasonable. So the math goes like this. The overall height of the tubs at scale is 469 thousandths, 15/32. From that, I subtracted the 94 thousandths for the Whaleline allowance. That brings us to 375 thousandths, or 3/8 of an inch. And you minus 1/8 of an inch for that, for the thickness of the top and the bottom of the plug, and that leaves us with 1/4 of an inch, 25 thousandths. So the 2 cross pieces need to be 1/4 of an inch tall, with a half lap joint in their middle. Now that we have all the dimensions, we can start making tubs, and that goes like this. I take 2 pieces of 16th inch thick basswood scrap, roughly an inch square. I find the center and draw out the circle of the top and the bottom. Now, something to keep in mind here is the diameter of 15/16 needs to be reduced by the thickness of the staves I'm using. I'm using white holly at 25 thousandths thick, so I have to subtract 50 thousandths from my diameter. Then I reduce it another 32 thousandths, 32nd of an inch. Because the tubs taper, and I want the finished diameter at the top to be 15/16, and the top of the armature will be 3/32, 94 thousandths. Down from that, I have to allow for that taper. I didn't bother to work it out mathematically, but I estimated that about a 32nd of an inch would get me what I was looking for. And it actually did. The finished tub sits comfortably between the number 4 and 5 thwarts. Now the top and bottom are fabricated exactly the same, so I'm only showing you the top of the plug here. And since I'm not using a lathe for this, I cut the top and bottom with a chisel. And you'd be surprised just how close you can get to round with a bit of practice. Now I wasn't too careful about it because I knew that subsequent steps would remedy any irregularities. You'll see in a minute. The two cross pieces are next, and for this, again, I turned to 16th inch basswood, just worked fine. I took two pieces of no particular length, but I cut them to exactly a 1/4 of an inch wide, and in the middle of each, I cut a half lap joint 1/8 of an inch deep by 1/16 of an inch wide. And when the two pieces fit nicely together, I brought them over to the drill press and drilled a 30 thousandths hole from top to bottom. I also drilled a hole in the center of the top and the bottom of the plug. Using a sewing needle in a pin vise, I dry fit the armature and made sure everything fit close to the finished size. With all the components cut and rough fitted, they can be glued up. In their rough state, they look like this. Now, next I refine the shape, and this was actually pretty painless. I mentioned that I was holding the assembly in a pin vise using a sewing needle and as a mandrel. It was my cunning plan to use a Dremel with a sanding drum to round down the rough cut discs into actual circles, trim down the sides of the centerpieces, and, probably most importantly, impart the bevel I would need to ensure that the staves had full contact with the armature top and bottom. To accomplish this, I put the assembly on the needle with the eye exposed, facing up and out, and the pointy end captured in the vise. This would allow the armature to spin freely on the needle when I put the sanding drum to it, but the eye would prevent it from flying off and getting lost in the multiverse that is my shop floor. I still haven't stopped patting myself on the back for that one. Hey, even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. Next are the staves. These would have been made from oak. At this scale, white holly does a great imitation of oak, and the staves on the tub in the Nantucket Museum were 3 inches. So I prepared a few strips of white holly, 25 thousandths thick by 94 thousandths wide, and I made a jig for cutting the staves to length. And I had an allowance in there, so they're oversized. Now the staves needed to be tapered, and at first I really wasn't sure how I was going to figure this out, but after thinking about it for a while, I realized if I knew the width of the staves, and I did, and I could figure out the circumference of the top and the bottom of the armature using pi, I should be able to figure out how many staves I would need and how they would have to taper. So once I had the circumference of the top, I divided it by 94 thousandths, my scale 3 inches, and I got 31.3. That's how many staves it would take to go around the top. I figured out the bottom circumference and I divided that by the number of staves. This gave me a figure of 66 thousandths. So the staves had to be 94 thousandths at the top and 66 thousandths at the bottom. It was surprisingly easy to do this and immensely satisfying to get it right. Wish I had realized this back in high school when I thought math class was the Latin term for nap time. Oh well. Using a chisel, I took 4 passes at the blanks, starting at one end, and with each pass I moved further up the blank until I was at the other end, where I tried very hard to remove almost nothing. This yielded a fairly nice taper. Now, of course, there were adjustments that had to be made along the way, but they were easy enough to spot. And I'm sure most of you will have guessed the last stave was not 3 scale inches wide at the top, but we knew that going in. I suppose I could have resized all the staves downward a few thousandths, but that seemed like an awful lot of work to go through just for a detail that wouldn't even be seen in the finished piece. Now I took a minute to knock off the sharp corners left on the staves. Now I did this with the sanding drum again, and then I sanded it down a bit further by hand to get rid of some of the cross-grain scratches left by the drum. Now, staining and weathering came after this step, but you all know what that looks like, so I won't bother to go into it here, and I'll just move on to the straps. Now I like making these from 100% rag vellum. The stuff is fairly stiff without being thick, and the surface is smooth and takes paint very well. I just cut a few strips, usually 1.5 scale inches wide, and I put a small clamp at one end just as a handle, and I mix up some paint. And here I'm going to use airbrush paint because of its thin consistency. I mix either burnt umber or burnt sienna with some black. I'm not too careful about which is more of which. I grab the strip at the clamp end and just drag the strip through the paint. And I hold it down with an old paintbrush, then hang it off the table to dry. They get fixed in place with CA glue. Now I'm sorry I didn't get footage of the whole process here, but I got enough to give you the idea. There's nothing special about this, except I have to pull fairly hard on the strap to get it to lay flat against the tapering sides of the tub. So it's important to make sure that the starting point is glued down really well. Both line tubs were done the same exact way, so no need to go through it a second time. And that's the tubs complete. We'll deal with more of the cooperage in further episodes. Getting the whale line to lay in the tubs neatly and convincingly is not for those easily deterred. In Ronberg's book, he describes how it was done in actual practice, but offers little for the model builder in the way of practical technique. But this is how it looks. A short length of line is left outside the tub. And this will usually have a back splice in it, so it can be joined to the eye splice in the line coming from the small tub. Inside the tub, the line is laid against the sides and coiled in a clockwise direction towards the center, creating a Flemish coil. And when the center is reached, it is laid flat on the coil back out to the outer edge of the tub, and the process is repeated until the tub is filled, literally to the brim. In this clip you can see a temporary cleat our green hand is using to keep him on track. Now, since rigging the line and the tubs is done later in the process, I'll leave it for now and we'll concentrate on the coils and getting a convincing appearance. And the easiest way to do that is with a tool specifically made for the task. Now, it's a pretty low-tech piece of equipment, and it doesn't take long to make, and of course it can be used for making Flemish coils for any model, not just this one. So you may want to consider adding this one to your arsenal. It consists of a Dremel mandrel, the type used for buffing pads or emery discs. It's got a screw on it, 2 pieces of clear plastic, and a bit of copper or brass tubing. And when it all goes together, it looks like this. Basically, it's just a movie reel. 2 flat discs held parallel to each other by a central hub. Now, if you decide to make one, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. The inside edges should be radiused. This will keep the line entering the tool smoothly. The height of the hub is the crucial thing here. It also is the most finicky to get right. You'll want it to be as close as possible to your line size without being undersized. A little oversized is okay, but undersized won't work. You'll have a top and a bottom disc. And the bottom disc will have a second small hole drilled right next to the central hole for the hub. This is where the line will be fed through. It's where your excess is going to be. The tubing you use has to accommodate the screw for the mandrel. Those screws are typically about 65 or 70 thousandths. I used 94 thousandths copper tube, and the inside diameter had to be drilled out a bit. So, keeping those few things in mind, you should end up with a very useful tool. Now, before I actually can start using the tool, I coat the discs with some furniture wax and then buff it well after it's had some time to dry. Since I use white glue in the process, this will prevent the sticking of your Whaleline coils to anything you don't want it stuck to. Another thing to consider before we start churning out Flemish coils by the mile is the display. The line tub I made has room to fit 2 or 3 flakes of line. And for this model, I wanted to show the topmost flake about half spent or so to represent the amount of line it would take to go from the tub to the loggerhead to the warp box and then finally to the harpoons. So I will need 1, but more likely 2 full flakes and 1 partial one. Now the process for the partial flake will be a bit different from the other 2. So we'll deal with the 2 full ones first. They're done exactly the same, so I'm only going to show you 1. No sense in repeating. To use the tool, I take a piece of Whaleline and thread it into the lower disc, and I leave just an inch or 2 of excess here. I put the top piece on, screw the whole thing into the mandrel. When screwing the 2 parts together, it'll be necessary to play with the tension to find a good balance between having the line not bind up and having it be so loose that it piles up on itself. And I find it convenient to hold the tool in a pin vise, and then I mount that in a bench vise. That leaves a hand free to adjust the tension on the fly. To start coiling the line, I prepare some white glue that I've diluted to almost water-thin consistency. And with an old brush, I paint the glue onto about an 8 or 10 inch length of the line and start coiling. Now the first few turns will be the hardest to get even and circular. And you'll go through those first 8 or 10 inches very quickly, so don't forget to apply more glue as you need it. Don't saturate the line, but don't be too stingy with it either. It also helps to have a mark on the upper disc to let you know when you're getting close to having enough coils. The Flemish coil you see me making here is for the small tub. The coil for the large one would go all the way out to that faint black mark that you see there. I let the coil dry undisturbed for at least half an hour. Then I can carefully remove it and see how I did. If all looks good, I'll glue it into the tub and do it again. And this is the process for all the full flakes. Now the partial flake goes like this. For this one, I leave enough line to lead from the coil to go to the loggerhead and then lead forward to the bow. For the full coils, I started right in applying glue. But here, I do the first part with no glue. I do it dry. When I get about halfway out to the edge, I start gluing the coil down. As before, half an hour minimum in the tool to let it dry, and then I see what we ended up with. I don't know why, but I didn't record the partial flake coming out of the tool. But I am happy to tell you it came out better than I hoped. And you can see it here on the bench, just by my fingers there, getting shoved around like a piece of junk. Now, since I have this partial flake, the flake below is obviously going to be visible, at least partially. That means the lead from the lower flake has to be included for this to look right. So I grabbed the end of that last full flake and grafted it onto the end of the line at the center. Now this is actually opposite of the real practice, but on the model, you really can't tell. So with that done, I can glue the partial in place. And it's done just like you expect and just like you see me doing. I did try to make it look as though the lead from the previous flake leads you right into where the partial flake starts, if that makes sense. But I have to admit, I was not totally successful. Something to aim for the next one. And that, at long last, is the line tubs complete. Now, like the oar locks in episode 9, these will not be installed until much later. But knowing they're finished and correct affords me a certain amount of satisfaction. And as a wise man once said, you should never defer an opportunity for satisfaction. And that will do it for this episode. Next time, we'll deal with a few details up forward and finish up the sailing rig. These were originally slated to go here in episode 12, but as usual, I went rambling on and I couldn't cram it all in. That'll be out fairly soon, since I have most of that footage already shot. So, as always, thanks for watching, and please hit those buttons if you like what you see. The more you do, the easier it is for others to find this content. And speaking of finding this content, feel free to share these with anyone or any organization you think might like them. So, until next time, remember to treat each other nicely. Now, break's over. Get back in the shop.